Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the 81st episode of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. We have a very big panel today, as you can see. We have our regulars, Ben Toth in Pech, Hungary. It's about 6 p.m. over there. Incomer from a suburb in Moscow at 7 p.m. there. Vladimir Golstein is one of our special guests. He is coming from, is it upstate New York?
No, Providence, Rhode Island.
Providence, Rhode Island. So Vladimir is a professor of Slavic studies at Brown University, and he's a friend of the show. We're very thankful he's joining us today. Carlo Parcelli, our regular co-host from Washington, D.C. It's about noon there. And then we have Chris Black coming from us from Canada, somewhere in Canada. Is it?
Ontario.
Ontario, okay. International law expert, Chris Black, and he's going to definitely share some expertise on this International Criminal Court happenings. Where to start, guys? There's several stories we want to get to. I'm thinking the very first story we were going to get to is going to kind of go hand in hand with our title. So our title for this episode was Anti-Zionism is the New Communism. And, you know, there's definitely an effort to demonize people who are anti-Zionist and people who oppose Zionism, and obviously, you know, equate them with being anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas, right? So recently, as part of this effort to, promote Zionism and promote what Israel is doing, actually it started on October the 7th. On October the 7th, a bunch of what the Washington Post describes as billionaires and business titans. This is literally the Washington Post description of these people. Billionaires and business titans were in a group chat over the Washington Post says around 100 people characterized as billionaires and business titans were in this group chat thinking of ways on how they can, support Israel, put pressure on the mayor of New York to, end the protests at Columbia University. And they even suggested hiring private investigators. You could say hired thugs to help support the police department in removing the protesters from Columbia University. So, Vladimir, Columbia is probably you're in competition at Brown University. Columbia is probably the competition. So you might not have been too disappointed to hear about this.
Well, I actually studied at Columbia when I arrived to this country. I ended up in New York and studied at Columbia. So I kind of, when in the news they talk about this Hamilton Hall taking over, I remember taking classes there. So, it's a very complicated, the whole issue, but you brought so many dimensions here. I would sort of say from the start, at least, you guys might not agree with me, but, there is nothing wrong in being, critical of Israeli policies from beginning to end, from, like Netanyahu to settlements, whatever. But the whole concept of Zionism is a little bit confusing. Why don't people call themselves anti-Israeli or anti-imperialist or anti-whatever? Because Zionism is just, is it a theory how applicable it is? Because, for example, if you think about the Soviet Union, in my experience there, it was a country, and it had a relationship to Stalinism, it had a relationship to Bolshevism, it had a relationship to socialism and communism, but it wasn't direct one. So it was also very much rooted in sort of in history and so on. So I think, this is a complicated issue. It doesn't mean that, as I said, it doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't be criticized. Of course, they should for many people, for many reasons, including the leadership there. But in terms of the protests, it's again, my take of that. Who are the students? This is you like to have this class approach. It's basically the children of the same elites. So what in my book is that their fathers, their parents sit there and say, let's have a discussion how we can minimize it or how can we turn it around in favor. Well, their children say, oh, screw you, we've heard it too many times, blah, blah, blah. So I wouldn't sort of imagine this protest at this moment as something totally progressive.
I do have a question, because you are at Brown University now. What is the atmosphere there in regards to Israel and Palestinians and what's going on in Gaza right now?
We started very early, and some students actually broke into president's office, and they were arrested. And 20 of them were arrested, and there were a lot of complaints. Faculty said, let them go, don't ruin their careers. So there's a lot of sympathy in the faculty and in the student body for what they were doing. Then somehow, there was several students actually attempted to have a hunger strike. But somehow kind of the whole thing, the university began to threaten them, saying, if you persist with hunger strike, we'll kick you out. And somehow the whole hunger strike petered out as well, because once you're no longer part of Brown, that's the whole kind of complication begins there. Eventually, after Yale and Columbia and everybody had the encampments, it occurred to Brown students, let's have encampment as well. So they had it. It was very peaceful. I know some faculty hang out there, talk to students. I don't think it was an atmosphere like I imagine. I haven't been here. I don't think it was an atmosphere in the 60s with teachings where people would be, lines were more or less clearly drawn. The students said, this is a bad thing what's going on there. Our university should have nothing to do with it. We want to divest. We reject this kind of imperialist, genocidal policy. Eventually, our president agreed with the students that they will present their case to the governing body, to corporation of Brown, and I think they actually did it recently. And then the corporation will vote about that in October. How they're going to vote? It's not binding, kind of, my feeling is they will sort of, they probably hope that by October things will kind of somehow die out and settle themselves, but from what I understand, I didn't read the fine print, but from what I understand, the students want to have certain kind of corrections in terms of Brown investment policy. Again, I have my sort of kind of skepticism about it, because sort of if you don't want Brown to invest in the companies which invest in Israel, the students themselves, they make themselves pictures of themselves with the cameras. They fly home and back on the same airlines from which they don't want the university to invest. I see it's, somewhat an exercise of hypocrisy. That's kind of, I see it.
Chris, are you surprised that this hasn't been a bigger story where 100 billionaires and business titans are talking on a WhatsApp group chat, trying to figure out how they can influence the elected government to crack down on anti-genocide protesters?
No, I'm not surprised. I don't think, after all the decades of history we have with who really runs capitalist societies, that they exert pressure when they're able, and they do it. And because behind the scenes communication was revealed to us about how they do it, we're supposed to be all shocked. I mean, we know this goes on. It's interesting who took part and what they were saying, but what's more shocking to me is the collapse of the university administrations under that pressure. It's not surprising that the corporations and with interest in supporting Israel and American foreign policy exerted that pressure to silence the protests, and hiring private detectives, mainly probably Pinkertons. We know the history of the Pinkertons. But I think more comments should be addressed to why the universities bowed under that pressure and didn't maintain their neutrality and let the students express their opinions and the freedom of association. I mean, I was a strike leader in 1971, McMaster University in Hamilton, when I was a student there. We took over the campus I think for about a week. There were mass protests across North America at that point, but in Canada it was partly about Vietnam, but also about the nuclear tests in Kamchatka Peninsula at that time, which risked a nuclear war then. So there were attempts to crack down on us, and we ended up negotiating with the governing body of the university. But our main objective was accomplished. We wanted to get into the press and put our point of view about these world crises, and we succeeded. And then it petered out, as all these protests do. So there was a class thing, because I think Vladimir is right in some sense that at that point university was quite cheap, and most of the students were working class. I was working class. There were some, of course, rich kids there, but now it's the nature of the student body has changed, I think.
Well, also the faculty themselves, aren't they really dependent on the donors, on the donor class? Yes, so the donor class is able to exert this kind of pressure because they are so much responsible for the functioning of the university itself.
Yeah, I mean, they buy hospital wings, they buy entire units, pay for wings in universities. My question to Christopher and Vladimir is, I think you're spot on the money, Chris, that these chats always take place. Whatever happens in the world, the powerful probably have a little discussion amongst themselves of how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? The question is, why do you think this one got leaked at this precipitous time? I think that's the interesting question.
I have no idea. I mean, it could be fortuitous, or somebody deliberately leaked it to expose them, and we don't know. I can't answer that.
Me neither, but it's an interesting can of worms, isn't it?
My feeling is that there is, I suspect that there is a division. There is no unity on this, because we all know that Israel is a contentious issue, even among wealthy Jews who kind of give money to universities. Many of them are very much skeptical about, Netanyahu, the policies and whatever. So maybe somebody felt righteous saying, no, I don't like what we're talking. So that's my feeling. It wasn't like, they all kind of in there together, so that's the whole paradox. There's a very, what bothers me, there is no division like that in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Because in terms of Israel, there is like a division. Some people, staunchly supported, something against, blah, blah, blah. With Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine wins the hearts and minds by being presented as holier than thou, and Russia is demonized, and there is no debate, no discussion. And I'm sure that there is something like that in Atlantic Council Foreign Affairs. They have these conversations. Should we send bombs? Should we do this? Nobody is leaking. We hear at State Department, one worker, another worker, walking out, protesting against Israel. Had anyone protest against what they're doing with Russia, basically pushing the whole world to the nuclear war? I mean, I
agree. I agree. Sorry, Vladimir, I had to jump in because I agree with you totally. What's really irritating me is that it's fine. I mean, to protest what's going on in Gaza is terrible. But we risk nuclear war with the aggression against Russia, which is what's going on, using Ukraine to do it. And the West, the United States and UK and its allies are risking world war. And there's no protest by anybody in the West. The peace movement doesn't do anything about it except protest against NATO. But then everybody says, well, why are you protesting against NATO when you say the attack by the special military operations is an illegal and brutal invasion? Shouldn't NATO defend these poor people? I mean, it's just paralyzed the peace movement because of this attitude. And there's no protest. There's nothing. And it's just shameful what's going on.
I'd like to ask a question on that same point that you just raised, Chris, about not doing anything, about risking nuclear war. And actually, this last comment. Actually, I recognize the name as one of my long-term readers on the blog, and so I just want to bring up what he said. Russia, China, communists, what have they done to us? So, have either of you in your spaces seen any kind of light bulbs go off in people's heads? Because, like you said, this brutal Russian invasion started, and people were literally saying it's the worst. People were literally saying it's the worst thing that's happened since the Holocaust. Russian missiles a fragment will hit one person. They're saying this is the worst thing that's happened since the Holocaust. But, now we see what actually happens when somebody the USA likes goes into a neighborhood. They just level it. There's no. So have either of you seen light bulbs going off in anybody's heads, putting those two things together? Like, well, changing their perspective on global, on geopolitics at all. Have either of you noticed that?
Well, for me, if in Canada here, I don't notice it because I speak out. I mean, there are a few people, but if you say that the statement that the Russian operations are illegal under international law, which without they never say why they think so, never give any legal reasons why they say so. And if I say I think it's legal under Article 51 of the UN Charter, you're called a traitor. I was called that by several so-called progressive leftists here on Twitter. You're a traitor for saying that. That's the attitude here.
Same in Europe.
Yeah,
you're Putinists.
So you're a Putinist. You're an agent. Now, even in Canada, if you support China as well, you're nobody talks to you. I live in a small town where people used to talk to me. Now, the last 2 years, nobody talks to me anymore. Nobody. I'm totally isolated.
So ridiculous.
We're going to take advantage. That's going to be fortuitous for us because you're always welcome on our program, Chris.
Yes.
We like to hear your point of view.
Well,
Yes, we do.
What about? Yeah, go ahead, Vladimir.
If I can add to this question about light bulbs, I mean, from what I observe on the news, on interviews, there is this, important and influential economist Jeffrey Sachs. He's now at Columbia, and he actually, was instrumental in having all the shock therapy and was more or less like spearheading, if you wish, American Western domination, economic domination. But he had an absolute change of heart. He kind of saw what's going on, and he now is very articulate. Possesses all this kind of economic information. He's at his tip of his hands, and he is actually kind of delivers what should be delivered. But he is one of the few.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Same happened to Scott Ritter. He loved Israel. He was born to kill a commie for mummy, and he's going to Russia to actually check out the place. And it's a very, very good change.
I want to ask about the hysterical tone that's been attributed to not only the protests on campus, but also to the determinations of the ICC and the ICJ, which I think are just, as Billy Bob and I and Ben were talking about, paper tigers. But there's this enormous hysterical response, and I think personally, it has to do with larger geopolitical changes. For example, BRICS. And the effectiveness of BRICS and the votes that have been going through the UN. I wonder if anybody wants to.
So that's our next topic. What's going on in the ICC? It's kind of unprecedented because the International Caucasian Court is supposed to just go after people in Africa or thugs like Putin. I mean that's actually true.
I don't have the clip, but that was from Karim Khan himself, an elected Western leader, which he didn't name, told that to him. You're supposed to go after Africans and thugs like Putin. And obviously Slav is like not white as well, because Putin's on the list. Yeah.
Let's defer to Chris first, but I want to get Vladimir in after. I mean, what is your take on the ICC, Chris?
Well, it just confirms it's just a totally political animal which serves Western interests. The document they issued, a statement they issued that they're going to ask a panel of judges for warrants for arrest against these Hamas leaders and Netanyahu and Gilad, whatever his name is. It's if you read it, it's really a very strange document because they don't charge Israel or Netanyahu with genocide, even though the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, found plausible evidence that genocide was being committed several weeks ago, but they don't refer to that. And you think they would. They only accuse Netanyahu and company with conducting an improper or siege using improper methods, that is not allowing humanitarian aid. They do not address the aerial assaults, which have killed 35,000 people. Most people have been killed by aerial assaults and soldiers going in and shooting people and occupations of hospitals and so on. That's not mentioned. It's just all about the siege and lack of supplies getting in. People are starving. Fine. But where's the genocide? And they mischaracterize the nature of the war. They have this. They're trying to square a circle they can't square. They say that the war between the Israeli operations against Gaza are an international armed conflict, but they say the Hamas military operations against Israel are a non-international conflict. That is an internal conflict to Israel, which is completely false, because the military action October 7th by Hamas was against the occupying forces of Israel on Palestinian lands. It was against an international aggressor. So they're trying to get out of that and confirm Israel's position that those are Israeli territory. And they say that several times in the document, that the attack took place on Israeli territory. It did not. It took place on Palestinian territory illegally occupied. They also say that Israel has the right to defend itself. It does, but not in the occupied territories. Well, there's several flaws. I can go into it otherwise, and in Hamas, they accuse them of things which we know through subsequent reports have been proven false, rape and this and that, and that the Hamas attack was mainly an attack against civilians, where actually the attack was mainly against military personnel, and so on. And they don't mention the hostages held by the Israelis, tens of thousands of them, including children without charge. That's not mentioned. And then and it seems to be an entirely British affair. Khan is British, and he uses this panel of experts who are all British, except Theodore Meron, who's an American judge, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's not a bad guy in some ways, because I think in the 1950s, he told the Israeli government that their attempts to take over certain settlements was illegal, and the occupied territory should not be used for illegal settlements. And he's pretty good on that. And but they also, and Baroness Kennedy was not bad, because she opposed the Iraq War, said it was illegal. But they're all members of the British establishment. Emil Clooney works for Zelensky and the Nazis. She works for the British intelligence, British Foreign Office. She's done lots of jobs for them. Same with Kennedy, same with the rest of them. So it seems to be a mainly British push. That's the look of it anyway. They're all British lawyers. And Meron, who is a double Israeli-American citizen and sometimes has done some good things, is a creature of the Council on Foreign Relations. So what have you got here? It shows there's a division between the United States and certain groups in Europe and Britain and other countries who are putting pressure on Khan to do something. And after 14 years, because they've had the file since 2014, when Palestine gave them jurisdiction, and I think just about 3 years ago, Fatou Bensouda, who was a prosecutor, stated that they had found that Israel was committing genocide, even in the events of 2014. But there's no charge of genocide here. So it's a mixed bag, and it's just a totally political stunt, a drama. Nobody's going to be arrested. Nobody's going to face trial, and yet, and this took years and years for them to charge the Israelis, almost 10 years.
It's specific people like Netanyahu and the West. Nancy Pelosi has said Netanyahu needs to go. Like, there's the liberal establishment here in the U.S. that says Netanyahu needs to go. So I agree. I see it as an overt political strategy to do a regime change in Israel and get somebody who's more compliant with Western interests. But Vladimir, let's hear your.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Chris explained all this kind of legal dimension very clearly. What shocked me is like unbelievable hypocrisy of the Western press. When all these courts judged Putin, they also, oh yeah, this is correct. Russia abducting children. They're not abducting children. These are like Russian speakers' families in Donbas region who are more than happy to be raised, not under bombs there within the culture which they know. But it was charged, they're abducting children. And I remember talking to people, I say, well, US doesn't recognize it. Why not now U.S. recognizes so much and pays so much attention. Yes, it's against Putin. The minute it's against Netanyahu, no, we don't recognize it. This is all nonsense. So it's they basically, law should be respected. It's kind of maybe last resort of some kind of of the societies, civilized societies. But this turns into profanation, and Chris is absolutely correct in viewing it as an English affair. And English are just they are very, very sensitive to the whole issue. They have their interest in the Arabic world, with Palestine, with Israel. So they are split, they are divided. So they're playing this game. But it's undercutting the seriousness of this kind of body, which we don't have that many international bodies which the world can take seriously. UN is very frequently felt as like the Hayden maiden of American imperialism, and now this court. And I remember what they did a long time ago with Milosevic. It's the same thing, They just,
so does Christopher, yes.
Yeah, I was one of his lawyers.
Yeah.
Well,
Can I quickly jump in, because
Sure.
I completely agree that this is a European British affair, and not just the compliant media. I think the Washington Post called this a make or break moment for the ICC, but it also rattled some of the right people. You've probably seen this, and we don't need to play the whole thing.
Hopefully, together we'll find a way to rest our displeasure with the ICC, because if they'll do this to Israel, we're next.
That's enough. That's the quotable segment. And I want to show you another one, which is indicative, which is...
America should punish the ICC and put Karim Khan back in his place. And if the...
Put Karim Khan back in his place. And this is the stuff that came out of the leadership. I mean, all of the Senate is now saying we're going to do travel bans. We're going to sanction him and his family, all the ICC stuff. And the alternate title for today's show was from Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Said they're enjoying this. They're having a ball, saying it's a spider in its own web or a scorpion that has stung itself. And they're really enjoying how hypocritical these are.
Well, first of all, Lindsey Graham, that was a confession then that the Americans are committing war crimes.
Isn't it?
But also they're behind the times, because the Russian government has already put out arrest warrants for the judges and Karim Khan. They already exist. But going something Vladimir mentioned about world bodies, you have some repute or some reputation in the world left. The ICJ itself compromised its position when the South Africans asked for remedial provisions against Israel, and all they told Israel to do was basically obey the law. That's all they did, just obey the law, don't commit genocide. And yet, when you said, why didn't they order Israel to withdraw its forces and stop its actions, people say, oh, it had no authority. How could it do that? Well, it did do that just 18 months ago to Russia. And the South African lawyers never raised it, which was really strange. They pulled their punches deliberately. They tried to play both cards, both houses against each other, or try and please both sides, because in March 2022, Ukraine made a request to the ICJ saying that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine, which is absurd. They presented no evidence whatsoever. Nevertheless, the ICJ immediately issued a provisional measure ordering Russia to stop its actions and to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. The South African lawyers could have said, you have a precedent. You did this to Russia. You have to do it to Israel, because the circumstances are even worse than what they allege there. But they didn't even mention it. And it was shocking to me. I mean, a law student wouldn't fail to mention a precedent like that, but they did. And they haven't mentioned it since. Nobody has. Nobody talks about it. It's just disgusting what's going on. I've been 20 years in this sort of business, and it never ceases to shock me, the hypocrisy that goes on, and the double standards and the twisting of logic. Truth.
It was a great legal team, although you might not know, this is maybe 1.5, maybe 2 hours old. The ICJ just made a ruling as in saying Israel must halt the Rafah offensive. I guess that's the best they can do, but that's all that happened. That's today. That's fresh.
Yeah, but if they must
not exactly saying get out of every Palestinian territory.
Yeah. Yeah, they went further with Russia, and then I don't know. What can you say?
Well, there's no
with
enforcement.
Milosevic. I mean, they murdered Milosevic, and nobody says anything. They murdered him in his cell. That's quite clear. They poisoned him.
What would you say if the? I mean, from looking at the Russian decision, I mean, what do you think, Chris? It doesn't seem like it seems like it's designed to not be a precedent because they didn't really accuse Putin or Russia of genocide either. They picked it was a very specific charge, you know, the abduction of children. It's like they deliberately really thought about what specific thing can we accuse them of doing that can't also, like, you know, if they just accuse the Russian armed forces of not safeguarding civilians or deliberately killing civilians, that would be something that could be used as precedent against America.
Yeah, you're right. That was
European.
It was strange that they chose what would be considered a relatively minor charge, kidnapping children, which is absurd on the face of it, as Vladimir says, it's absurd. And now
pulling them out of a war zone. Whereas
now we find that some of the named children are actually in Germany, and some have been returned by Russia to safe areas now in Ukraine. But anyway, yes. Why did they do that? I think they had no evidence, of course, that Russia's committing any war crimes intentionally in Ukraine. So they chose something which would have very deep emotive impact. That's why you do these rape charges. Always like rape charges. Kidnapping children is going to get everybody all upset against this monster Putin. He's kidnapping children, like the Pied Piper. You know, he's like taking the children and massacring. This is how propagandistic the ICC is. Just a propaganda tool, and the West uses it for that purpose. And that the prosecutors, all three prosecutors they've had since Ocampo, have all been serving Western interests since the ICC started.
Yeah, and Ian is a good point that they had to pick something that couldn't be used against the United States, and so that's a great point. And so they picked this little obscure thing because any other kind of wording is going to be even more hypocritical than they already are. But yeah, these bodies have just been co-opted and infiltrated by the West, and they essentially are run as Western tools of imperialism. And you know, most people without the expertise of Chris Black, you know, understand that intuitively, and they don't really put a lot of you know, trust in these international institutions. And it's too bad because we need these international institutions. International institutions are absolutely essential. What's not essential is, you know, them being totally run and dominated by the West, by the US particularly. Before we get into attacking the ideology of liberalism, because I want to do that, I want to just get Vladimir. I'm sure he has some comments.
No, I not about that, but I think we should probably, one of the issues which we want to address is this kind of saber rattling of NATO and the West, talking that we, you know, I hear it on NPR, I hear it everywhere, from Blinken to everyone. We should send more weapons to Ukrainians. We should send weapons which would hit Russian cities. This is just such a unbelievable provocation.
Using a Kagan Family Institute for the Study of War map to do that, to call that. Let's hit the rear. Let's hit the Russian cities. Just amplifying your point. Sorry, and we don't need to watch it.
And basically, what it doesn't consider, they think that they are protecting Ukraine. In fact, they are just provoking Russia into more aggressive, actions. You know, if they start bombing Russian cities, the whole, Russia will go mad. And it's basically let them send our offensive weapons, so more Ukrainians will get killed. Right. Another thing, if the court has to investigate something, I keep on seeing on the news again and again, desperate measures which Ukrainian kids are doing not to be drafted into the army. They're
drowning in the rivers.
Yeah, they drown in the rivers. They try to cross the borders. They are, poisoning themselves. They are exploding themselves on some grenades. Just so, and there is like a military body runs around, captures everyone. I've read about some guy who actually said he was like 60 some years old. I have heart conditions. No, you can do that. So he had a heart attack, during the first day of training. So this is actually absolutely kind of, genocidal attack on their own population. Go and become a cannon fodder. Yeah, of course, everybody's silent about that.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I agree. The Russians now have warned Britain, especially, but also France and the United States, that if you continue to attack Russian cities, which they're doing, this whole thing about Blinken saying and the Congress saying we want permission to use these weapons, they're already using these weapons.
They just struck as in tonight, last night. They just struck Crimea. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just a show. But they're already using these missiles to attack Russia, and Russia's given the warning, and they won't give another one. They've told Britain, we're going to strike you. And I'm British by background, and I remember London when I was a boy, my mother taking me into London and seeing miles and miles of blacked out buildings from the war. I mean, it was unbelievable. Just went on for miles, just burned out, blacked out buildings. That's what, and I'm not sure Russia will do that, but they will hit military facilities and decision command centers, and they can do it not only in British bases overseas, but in Britain itself. And I think they will. And people don't realize, they're just oblivious to what risks they're facing. The British attitude is, oh, they wouldn't dare. And they don't know that Russia will certainly dare. Yeah. And Vladimir is right. You keep these attacks up, all holds are off. You know, they're just going to do everything.
To add to that, Zelensky, everybody knows his term expired 3 days ago, which is why Annalena Baerbock flew in to say, we recognize you, and she got the Order of Merit or something, some medal to take home and put him on the shelf with Orpa's Nazi medals. But in the meantime, the West, because you know this doesn't come from Lithuania, you might have seen this, they allow themselves to still define the goals as we know they were originally. Take a quick listen to this.
Russia's defeat is not a bad thing, because then, you know, there could be really a change in the society, and you know, there are many different nations right now part of Russia as well. I think if you would have more like small nations, it's not a bad thing if the big power is actually much smaller. So
I mean, she's actually articulating this is what victory looks like, balkanizing, turning Russia into many smaller states. And she can see this openly, you know. And she didn't pick this up at a nightclub in Lithuania. She probably picked it up at a nice State Department dinner or somewhere, because this didn't come from her.
I think there must be. I'm thinking that there must be secret treaties between the NATO allies, dividing up Russia and assigning to each nation certain parts of Russia.
Yeah,
I think there are secret treaties which exist, and that's why they keep pressing this war. They all want a piece of the action, and that's why Russia has to do everything to defend itself.
I think there is. It's you know, I've heard it from so many corners. It must have been like a new directive formulated by the State Department, by all these think tanks, split Russia apart. And you know, because I hear it from Russian liberals who live in Russia, I hear from Russian immigrants, I hear it from Lithuanians and Latvians and Germans and French and everyone, and they think it's such an innocent thing. You know, this is the most dangerous idea ever.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, but they think they can just say this on open air, completely out in the open. So it strikes me like it's weird. I know that maybe people talk about this in little strategic top secret circles, but just like this, overtly.
Yeah. Well, I was in Belgrade when the Crocus attack took place, and a conference commemorating the NATO attack on Yugoslavia, and the Chinese were there because they bombed China at that point too. And Russians, I met some Russian officials and diplomat, and they're very, very angry about the Crocus attack. The whole mood has changed. I mean, I think there's a lot of pro-Westerners in Russia still, maybe wish the war wasn't going on. Who doesn't? But I think the whole mood now has totally changed since the Crocus attack, which the peace movement here didn't mention at all, didn't protest at all, didn't say anything about at all. But that's changed everything in Russia as far as I'm concerned. When I was there, the mood was deep, deep, deep anger and sadness, and I can't express how they felt. It just
they donated so much blood in the coming days. It was beautiful. But for many, I think in Moscow, it was hundreds of kilometers away. Russia is big, but it came home. It became real. That's why Mr. 87% got elected. It became very real. But on this point, because I still have you, sorry, Billy Bob, I'm going to be a little bit selfish here. you might. Oh, but breaking news: Mr. Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, said there's uncontrovertible this morning. There's uncontrovertible evidence that the GUR, as in I like the dark, Budanov's outfit, the military intelligence outfit in Ukraine, was involved in the Crocus attack. That came out this morning. But I just have to ask you, because it looks like they're trying to explode every other front they can. You know, number one being Georgia, trying to force this color revolution because of the change, and the second one, Fico got an assassination attempt. He's doing okay, and the third one, which I mean, I found baffling. The Germans initiated this. It was yesterday or 2 days ago, the UN resolution to remember the Srebrenica massacre, which is right up your alley. And they got not really a huge majority. More people voted no and voted to abstain than voted yes. Hungary was the one European nation who said no, by the way. And Vasilia Nabenzia had some choice words. The Germans, started 2 world wars and massacres. You don't have any right to talk about them. And he said, one thing is clear. The sponsors of this resolution are deliberately pushing Bosnia into conflict without regard for the price that country paid during the civil war, the 1990s, when 100 people perished. This resolution is a threat to peace and security in the entire region. And Milorad Dodik, the head of Republika Srpska, which is about half of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, said that in the coming weeks, as in tomorrow starting, we will try a peaceful independence resolution from Bosnia and Herzegovina based on this. I really wanted to get your thoughts on this, and then Billy Bob stopped.
Rwanda co-authored that initiative, by the way.
Yes, Rwanda and Germany.
I'm glad you mentioned Rwanda. Kagame, who has slaughtered maybe up to 13 million people in Rwanda.
And was in 10 Downing Street a week ago.
In the last, since 1990. It's the last person you would think would, but he's controlled by the British. They installed him in power with the Americans and Canadians. They promoted his slaughter across Central Africa to try and control the resources of the Great Lakes region and the Congo. It's just disgusting what's going on. And you saw that they saluted, they welcomed the Nazi Azov battalion in the House of Lords or Parliament somewhere, just like the Canadian Parliament welcomed and cheered the SS man. It's just, you can see who we're dealing with. We're dealing with Nazis. We've gone back. The Nazis have become openly active. It's no longer covert. Back in the shadows, they're openly Nazi now. And nobody says anything here.
What you were saying, you're talking about this. Last time, the one thing Britain did right is they didn't join the Axis. This time, this is Boris Johnson, who's nobody, as in the power structure.
My message to you is very simple. Thank you to the heroes.
Oh my God.
And that's enough of that, because I can't stand more of these either. Just the first couple of seconds, the heroic Azov Brigade in, I think, the Parliament building somewhere.
Yeah.
So the question for me is, how does this play out? And I know Gilad Atzmon on Facebook, we're Facebook friends. He was mentioning that he is, always monitoring right-wing Israeli propaganda, channels. And one of the high-ranking intelligence officers that was being interviewed was saying, the crimes going on against Gaza, don't worry about those. We need to go ahead and get it done, because the World War III that's coming is going to have so much destruction and devastation that nobody's even going to remember what we're doing in Gaza. And so what is your guys' opinions about the future? And has there already been a decision to just escalate into total World War III, or is World War III going to be somehow avoidable? Vladimir, what are your thoughts?
Well, I remember this title of the book. I always use it about the First World War, sleepwalking into the war. That's what I have a feeling. I don't think they make a decision, but they are doing like absolutely, all these examples from Boris Johnson to weapons to everything. They're doing the work for Russian propaganda, because when the Russians started their tension with Ukraine and they were there were a lot of Russians think, oh, maybe it's Putin's paranoia, maybe we're two fraternal people, what are we doing? Now Russians see it very seriously, very clearly. That's the West with all our ways through terrorism, through murdering prime ministers, through blowing up people in Russia. This is all Western kind of thing. So if they want to get this Russian bag going, what's the point? It's going to be the end of the world. Chris mentioned it. They somehow cannot gauge the degree of A, Russian unity, and B, Russian anger, and C, Russian identity. The Russians might be absolutely lazy, absolutely lackadaisical, absolutely relaxed. The minute they feel, threat, let's go. Poles invading, they were kicked out. Swedes invaded, they were kicked out. French, German. So Russians actually thrive on it. They become like, a tradition that part of the Russian kind of tradition comes from this northern Scandinavian. They go berserk. So is the West ready for Russia? So I mean, I cannot blame Israelis. Yeah, in the big scheme of things, of destruction of the world, let's grab Gaza. Who will notice that?
Yeah, true. Yeah, I agree. I think the risk of world. Well, I think we are in a world war. I think it's
it's a slow motion one, isn't it?
Because if you look at World War II, the events sequentially, there was the attack. There was a takeover of Czechoslovakia. Nothing much happened. Then they attack the Sudetenland. Then they attack actually Poland. Then there's almost many months of peace. They declare war against France, but the French don't do anything because they're collaborating with the Germans. The British don't do anything. And then they wanted to invade Russia. So Hitler said, well, I got to knock France and Britain out because I don't trust these guys. Then there was it. And then they attacked it. So it's sequentially. And that's what we're seeing now. There's a war in Gaza. There's a war in Ukraine. There's just things against China. It's all.
Jimmy Lai, the new president of Taiwan, is very eager to get this show on the road. Now he's blockaded by the largest drill ever.
But I think the Ukraine and Iran. I mean, the attacks on Iran go on. So I agree with Vladimir. I think there must be secret treaties. Ukraine, even if they're defeated in Ukraine, and obviously they're going to be militarily defeated in Ukraine vis-a-vis the Ukrainian army forces. But this war is a long war. They intend to break up Russia no matter what. And that's just the first phase of it. If they fail in Ukraine, they will not cease in their attempt to break up Russia. And that's going to lead to world war. And the Russian government now finally realizes what's going on. I mean, I think they're going to react. And I hope not. I mean, I hope the West calms down, but I don't see that happening. All I see is it escalating.
Well, I'll bring up the example of the Winter War with Finland. That was I think that's a good example of what at the time was considered a very big war. It was probably the biggest war since World War I up until that point. And, they did kick the Soviet Union out of the Olympics, and they did, all the sanctions and the hysteria and hand-wringing over it. But, everything that happens in the Winter War was overshadowed, of course, by the subsequent flare-ups. And now it's almost
true.
like a footnote.
That's true.
To illustrate,
go ahead.
This is a Hungarian, but to illustrate how they're ready to blow everything up, I think this is something worthy of. You probably know that the Prime Minister of Georgia, Mr. Kobakidze, if I'm not mistaken, I hope I didn't butcher his name, said, I got threatened by an unnamed EU commissioner, look at Fico's fate. And that unknown commissioner was Mr. Adam Varhelyi, Hungarian, who had this to say that, of course, all right, let me just read it. During my phone conversation, I felt the need to call attention to Prime Minister the importance of not to inflame further the already fragile situation by adopting this law, which could lead to further polarization and possible uncontrolled situation on the streets of Tbilisi. In this regard, the latest tragic event in Slovakia was made as an example, as a reference to where such high level of polarization can lead in society, even in Europe. That is an absolute, maybe veiled, he thinks.
That's a threat.
This is where they're going now. They're openly saying, look, we wouldn't like you to catch a cold. This is the language they're speaking in diplomacy today, guys.
So that brings up where I kind of wanted to go with it. There's an elephant in my head. I don't know if anybody else has it. But, last episode on Tuesday, we got considerably more views than we normally do, and a lot of detractors in the comments. we were kind of attacking John Mearsheimer. So Mearsheimer, of course, has good analysis with as regards to Russia and Israel, but ultimately he also typifies this liberalism, this imperialism, and it's about smart imperialism. It's not about cooperation and working together as a species. It's about, block mentality, zero-sum games between great powers. And that's liberalism in a nutshell. And the liberals in the West project that same mentality onto Russia and onto China mistakenly, because, Russia and China aren't interested in these kind of imperial, conquests. But if we can play this one clip here, it's less than a minute. But let's listen to this, and then I'm going to ask for a response.
Now, some people say there's an alternative. You can go with China. Right? You have a choice here. You can go with China rather than the United States. There's two things I'll say about that. Number one, if you go with China, you want to understand you are our enemy.
That's Serbia and Hungary, by the way. We have become the enemy now.
You are then deciding to become an enemy of the United States. Because we're talking about an intense security competition. You're either with us or against us. And if you're trading extensively with China and you're friendly with China, you're undermining the United States in this security competition. You're feeding the beast from our perspective. And that is not going to make us happy. And when we are not happy, you do not want to underestimate how nasty we can be. Just ask Fidel Castro.
So,
right.
I think, when we're talking about being nasty, that's Crocus, right? That's these.
Wait. We have to be fair. We don't know if he was sort of characterizing the current diplomatic and foreign policy establishment. I don't think he was speaking for himself. He was.
I don't think so either. I think he was characterizing the dominant view in the American Congress.
The loonies, the Boltons, and those people.
Okay, let me respond to that then, because what he's actually doing, he's asserting this is how things work. This is inevitable, and he's projecting that same mentality onto China and onto Russia. And so even if he's not advocating for it, in a way he is advocating, because he's saying there is no alternative, which as socialists, we know there is a fucking alternative.
Well, I think I agree with Ben that probably you got the rest of the conversation, he was saying this is what the elites are thinking. And we got to oppose this. We didn't get the other section of that, because I don't think he could honestly think that himself. I don't think he thinks
I've never heard him argue for cooperation with China. I've always heard him accuse our Russia policy was bad, not because it killed 1 million Ukrainians, but because it drove Russia into China's arms. And China is our peer rival, which we need to deal with. That's always his assertion.
If that's the case, I take your word for it. If that's the case, then he's wrong, because there obviously is an alternative. We can all get along and cooperate. What's wrong? Doesn't matter whether you got a socialist system or a capitalist system. People can choose what they want. If they think a socialist system is better, let them have it. Capitalist system, okay. I don't agree with it, but okay. Some people like it, and it's got its benefits. Why can't we all get along, trade peacefully, and do what we do best? No, because they don't. Because they're imperialists, and they want to and they're colonialists. They want to dominate the world, and that's it.
Yeah,
and Mearsheimer kind of enters into that reality by saying that's just how it is. Like there is no alternative. The U.S. has to respond to these threats in the way they're doing. So, but anyway, we can leave that.
Vladimir, can I add something?
Yes,
an important op-ed opinion piece came out in Financial Times. Anybody familiar with the name Elbridge Colby? He's high in the U.S. circles. He was a co-author of the 2018 National Security Plan, or whatever that is. And he came out with this, I think, amazing. It's worth reading in full, that America must face reality and prioritize China over Europe. And he says immediately after that, we're not betraying anybody, but there's a reality on the ground, and there's a finite military resource that America has, and it's just not enough everywhere. That's the kind of realism I think both of these people have. They are faced with, we used to be able to do everything everywhere all at the same time, and now, oh shit, We need to come up with something realistic. That's kind of the same I see here.
Go ahead, Boris.
I agree with you. What's happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union? There was a golden age of American hegemonism, of American imperialism. They somehow, it occurred to them, oh, we can run the show. We can basically do regime changes. We can start the wars
anywhere
on the fake kind of pretexts. We can bomb, Serbia. We can do this, whatever. Well, now the bus kind of is left the station, but somehow, it's very difficult. I always bring an example. Your father, to your 10-year-old kid, you can say, go to bed, do this. If your kid is 25, he's not going to listen. So we're no longer in this one polar world, and somehow to American establishment it's next to impossible to come up. How the whole thing will work out, I don't know. I agree with Billy Bob that this zero-sum game is not a correct way of thinking. There should be some kind of better way of sort of cooperation, and if somebody likes this cutthroat American capitalism, they can try to make it succeed here in California or wherever they want to do that. But somebody else want to do this other way. But I think it shouldn't be just our way or highway, and that's kind of, I think, that's what he was airing. That unfortunately, the establishment which grew up from let's be honest, from late 80s to now, at least 40 years, that Americans were calling all the shots. They can put their
and they're stuck there, aren't they? In the 90s, they still believe that's the world they live in. They
still believe they can put their hearing devices in a Merkel telephone and hear what Germans do. They can do this. They can call that. And it used to be, by the way, French leaders, de Gaulle, he would actually argue with them. Swedes, Palme was challenging. Now sort of, okay, we got rid of Palme. We have Macron, who is just dancing to our tune. But it's I think it's kind of over. But this is we all know from Roman Empire to many other empires that the last years of this collapsing empires can be very deadly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah,
Rome never had nuclear weapons, fortunately.
Chris, I think you wanted to address this, maybe. If not, I have one more item I really want to share.
No, go with that. Go the
because
I've lost what I was going to say.
Sorry, inadvertently, things have changed so much. The SMO and also the Middle East. I mean, the Russians you were talking about, who left, the liberals, the emigres, half of them, this was in Izvestia, half of them came home convinced that Putin was right. They really hate us in the West. They really want to destroy us.
Yeah.
It's a sea change. And when it comes to the Middle East, there's not been a lot of attention given to this. But today, Vladimir Putin is in Minsk, in Belarus, talking with Lukashenko about the second phase of the nuclear whatever. But yesterday, the King of Bahrain, I know it's just one of those Gulf monarchies who used to be wed to the West, but they have their own interests. They have their own public opinion. He was in Moscow. He got a new Aurus limousine, which is now tradition after little Kim Jong-un also got one. Anyway, and they talked, and I thought these two by Sputnik International, these two quotes were absolutely amazing. He told Vladimir Putin that for the first time, the position of the Arab countries has been characterized by unanimity on the issue, as in the Middle Eastern peace, Israel, Gaza, all that. So there's full agreement that there needs to be a peace summit. And for that peace summit, Russia is the first country to which we have turned with a call to support in holding, as Russia is the most influential country on the international stage. That's from the King of Bahrain, right? The US is no longer part of this, guys. I think that's an enormous sea change. I mean, Zelensky's trying to do this peace conference in Switzerland where he dictates to Russia how Russia should surrender. But even his 10-point peace plan had been reduced to 3 points. He's feeling this might not be very successful. Meanwhile, the world has just blown in the other direction. Wanted to share that with you.
Yeah.
That's all true. No, that's that's the reality, and I think the sooner people will realize it. But what also happened during this American hegemony, it's kind of maybe bad kind of coincidence that EU became a totally kind of unified organization, and which controlled by US, and this is
completely subjugated. I agree.
Of course, there is, occasional sort of, protests, Hungary and, Slovaks or Poles, whatever. But it's kind of, such a bad timing when rather than kind of interacting and trying to be voice of reason, Europeans have their relationship in Arab world, Israel, China. They should probably bring their own expertise to the table rather than just playing. No, they're not doing it.
Instead, they commit economic harakiri on order.
I think that that's basically for domestic Bahrain, because the people in Bahrain, just like any other Muslim country, they're overwhelmingly angry about what's happening in Gaza. But until they close down the huge naval base in Bahrain, the U.S. naval base in Bahrain, I'm not going to believe any of that hype.
Yeah, it's lip service.
True. There's a lot of that going on. Yep.
I might give you a small ray of hope. When I was in Belgrade, I had dinner with a French army colonel who was at the conference, and he had been at a meeting. He said he just got off the phone with two French generals, one of whom I know. And they had a meeting with Macron about sending French troops to, they were already there, but officially sending them there in large numbers. And he said there was a very heated exchange in which they told Macron that he's insane and that they said, you cannot do this, and we may refuse to obey your orders.
Holy, thank you. That is good news.
I said, well, would they actually do that if push comes to shove? And he said, I don't know if they would or not, but that's the mood. It's not all one way. But the French army always has had, they're guilty of some crimes in West Africa and North Africa and so on, but they do have a different sense of things than the British army does or the Americans and Germans.
But even the American army is probably more experienced, and I hear some generals who say, wait a minute. So usually it's politicians, and for some reason British army is always like in cahoot with their insane government.
Yeah. I want to bring up a can of worms. A few weeks on this show after the Iranians drone and missile strike on Israel, and Israel's rather flaccid retaliation of that, I said that the Israelis were not over with their counterattack, and now the president of Iran and his foreign minister, President of Iran Raisi and his foreign minister, have been killed in a helicopter crash, and to my mind, I see that as part of the retaliation for the attack on Israel. Just call me crazy, but what do you guys think?
Well, the Iranian government put out a statement yesterday saying that that's not true. The first report has come out as of yesterday. You can find it on Press TV. The initial report is there's no signs of foul play on the aircraft.
Mechanical failure. Right.
As a or the pilot, because they were coming, they saw clouds. They were told to go above the clouds. He may have misjudged the distance and hit a hill, and came down. Apparently, the pilot was still in communication after they crashed. Then he died. Must have been injured, saying that they crashed. And it looks like it's a crash, but an accident, an unfortunate accident. However, you're right in the sense that the West and Israel can use the election process coming up as a window of destabilization inside Iran. That could take place.
And I do want to say that Iran has bent over backwards not to retaliate on Israel, and maybe even given the assassinations, they're still much more interested in development than they are in war, because they've just rebuilt their economy, and they don't want to have a face off in a conflict. I don't know if they would go that far as to cover up an assassination like that. And the other thing is, to me, is that Richard Medhurst reported that it was I don't know what, a Russian helicopter or something. No, it was an American Bell helicopter, and it was old. It was used by the the Shah of Iran and Savak for all back in the day. So
under sanctions for 50 years. So
the
that's
repairs were done in Canada. I'm very suspicious about it.
Well, there were 3 helicopters flying in formation, and the other 2 helicopter pilots said they saw this cloud bank bank of mist, and and the lead helicopter said, "Let's go above it," and they did. But they said when we came out of the cloud, the other one wasn't there. He may have just misjudged it. So,
I mean, helicopters crash fairly frequently. I mean, and the thing is that rich people and government leaders and senior military leaders use helicopters more than anyone else. I don't have my own personal helicopter to fly around, so the odds of me dying in a helicopter crash are a little low because I just don't ride helicopters. But
I
do happen.
If you allow me to say a couple of words about Iran and this. First of all, I think that was a good argument by Andrew Karipko, this American who is, analyst, lives in Russia. And he said that was, I go with Carlo, Israelis or somebody try to sort of set it up. Okay, but who could they be that powerful to put like 3 or 4 important people in one helicopter? It was just basically sloppiness over Iranian side. They were sloppy. They were either too confident or too sloppy, and these things happened. I remember when there was a Polish president flying to Russia in Katyn, to celebrate something, and he's playing right away. All these gun-ho Poles. Oh yeah, these are Russians. These are Russians. No, it just these things happen. So I kind of don't see it. But what I would say is, like, I've heard, I never traveled to Iran, but I've heard from many people who go there, and from just what you see, is actually a rather pragmatic country which wants sort of to do economically well and so on. However, for Israel, it's like probably like for United States, it's like Russia perennially demonized. Israel, they
celebrated openly
they thrive on demonizing Iran. That's kind of their modus operandi. They just cannot stop. Like, Iran is behind. So, and they milk it. Maybe Iran tries to answer in kind, demonizing Israel. But so they play this game, even though both countries are probably rather do pragmatically make money and take advantage of like Arabic world, as far as I can see.
I also want to add that there's a powerful instrument within Iran. Actually, Iraq, that's where they're based, on the eastern border. But in Iran, and it's called, we all know this, Mujahideen al-Khalq. That's the Mech. Right. And they're perfectly capable. They've had long experience at this kind of sabotage. As far as putting the foreign minister in the same helicopter as the president, yes, that's an error, but it may just have been, a twofer as far as the Israelis, the U.S., the British, and the Mech were concerned. I'm very, very suspicious.
We can go into speculation, and we're all suspicious, but I have a feeling we won't know the truth. But before we do that, can I add just one factual point, data point to this? Because whenever this happened, I might be wrong, maybe Sunday, when first it was hard landing, before it was confirmed that Raisi was dead, right? And the next morning, Vladimir Putin went into the Kremlin and had an extraordinary meeting. It was Mr. Narishkin, the foreign intelligence chief, Shoigu, the head of the Security Council secretary, now he was the old Minister of Defense, the new Minister of Defense, Mr. Belousov, were all there, and the Moscow envoy from Iran, the ambassador. And I don't know, there was a very limited readout what took place there, but it was basically, I think, whatever happened, we got your back. But think for a second, even if some bad mishandling of a situation happened, a foul play, it's not in Iran's interest to release that to the public. I think it's everybody's interest to say, mechanical failure, and we might never learn about it. But if there was something, I mean, the Westerners saying, I hope it was sabotage. You better hope it wasn't. If it's obvious that there was a foreign hand in this, Iran is you don't want that. That's what I'd say. So yeah,
We have surpassed the 1 hour minute mark. And for the next hour, I'm going to have Vladimir and Chris debate Zionism.
Debate Zionism. Yeah.
that would be entertaining for me.
We have to bring in Herschel.
What's that?
We have to bring in all the history. That would be.
Oh yeah, no, that would take way more than an hour.
And I'm sure Vladimir knows a lot more about that than I do. I don't know.
But it was a good joke.
One of these days we'll do that. That's a good idea.
But, what about, Ben touched on it earlier, the blockade of Taiwan. So I guess yesterday, China just did a little muscle flexing without firing any weapons or any shots, just kind of circled the island of Taiwan and, let it be known that, if China has to, if the Independence Party in Taiwan gets so hysterical and China is forced to blockade and force a uniting between the island and the mainland, they'll do it. And they can do it without firing a shot. And there's nothing the West can do about it. If the West wants to, turn it into a war, they can, but they're going to lose that war. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think that Putin's visit to Xi Jinping a few days ago had something to do with the present.
The embrace seen around the world.
Right. I think discussions took place there of major things. First, the Russian response to the West aggression against them in Ukraine and the tactical nuclear missile exercises. I think he had to explain to China what his intentions are, and I think they discussed what to do about Taiwan. And then Lai exacerbated things with his crazy treasonous speech. So I think serious things were discussed at that meeting we won't be aware of until they actually take place. And the present blockade of Taiwan, which is still going on today, where they've actually blockaded the entire island and all the sub-islands, it said today on Global Times that it may continue indefinitely, but I'm not sure about that. But I think big things are going to take place.
Yeah, I think.
And now Putin's going to see Lukashenko or something's developing. I'm not sure what.
Even Mearsheimer on your show, on the segment which you played, talked about how sort of Russia and China pushed into the hands of each other, and that's a success or failure of American policy, because basically these guys know very well that they have to stand by each other. It's like in this cowboy movies, they're standing having each other's back, because if one gives in, then it'll be much easier for the West, for NATO to take them to take them apart and so on. So I think they always talk about it. There's no doubt about that. We have your back here, and we have your back there. We can't allow us to stand on our own. And I think Russia maybe, right after Perestroika, there were some leaders who had naive belief that West is actually the way to go, and maybe we can bridge our relationship and push China aside. Not any longer. I mean, there is no sane people in the top position of power who would believe that now.
Did you catch Sergei Lavrov pronunciation to this effect? He was probably for a generation, maybe two. We are done with Europe.
We're done. Absolutely.
It's done. Yeah.
And he is a diplomat. He did all his best. I remember how shocked he was at certain moment when a British leader, like a short-term leader, like 2-week leader, what's her name? Liz Truss.
Yes.
Yeah, she flew over there and they had conversation. And he was just shocked. He said,
I remember this.
Talking to the wall. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. So it's just useless. It just this is just they have this very funny Russian term, incapable of making an agreement. And then finally, no, that's the reality. And I think Chinese are very shrewd. They observe every little move West versus Russia, and they know that they will be next in line if they allow that to happen. So I think that's the reality. So the better somehow to bring all these forces in and indeed cooperate, rather than trying to push and whatever this this Western establishment thinks, they will never ever be able to, to deal with Russia and China, united.
You referenced perestroika a couple times, Vladimir, and it seems that, perestroika was predicated on the lie that liberalism is serious about its liberalism, and how we were really, really gonna just, be friends, and we were gonna get economically beneficial, relations. Peace through mutual prosperity, essentially, was what was promised to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And, NATO won't move one inch closer to Russia. But it was this peace through mutual prosperity, this seriousness about respecting sovereignty of other countries that, liberalism promotes and pretends to embrace. But it's a hypocritical lie. And, ultimately, liberalism is the ideology of the Western ruling class, the elites, and they're going to, manipulate their principles in a way that furthers their interests. And they're not going to hold to them one day, and then one day they're going to insist that, you're violating the principles, so we have to attack you. And it's just so hypocritical. But what else can be said? We're an hour and 15 minutes in. Where do we want to go from here?
Russia, I wanted to say about Russia, you only go through the horror of the 1990s once. And thankfully, the leadership was with open eyes saying, we cannot let this happen again. I think since 2014, they've been preparing. And since 2022, China's been preparing. Do you know they just sanctioned 12 military corporations in America because they sent such stuff to Taiwan? They're ratcheting up against Europe, probing their overcapacity, saying, we can strike back. Russia is doing the exact same moment. And just the end thought for me on Gorbachev, that wasn't get along. That was the rhetoric. That was an absolute capitulation of the Soviet Union to the West. And I think most Russians know this.
I have a question for everyone here because I'm looking at our panel. Is fear of nuclear war generational? And I'm referring back to the Scott Ritter, Carl Zhao debate, I guess you want to call it, about nuclear war, where Scott Ritter, I don't think he minds. He's 62. He's younger than I am. But and Carl Zhao, who's much younger. Carl Zhao's, as far as I could see, his attitude toward nuclear war was flippant. And as far as Scott Ritter's attitude towards nuclear war, he was much more genuinely concerned about the possibility of it. And Chris already alluded to it. I can tell he's very concerned about the possibility of nuclear war. Go ahead.
I was, when I went to the conference in Belgrade in mid-March, the topic was not only a NATO attack, but how can we make the world secure and peaceful? What can I say? What can I say possibly which has any relevance to anything? I was scratching my head and I started reading a lot of things. And I came across Jack Kennedy's 1961 speech calling for general and complete disarmament. Following on Premier Khrushchev's call in 1959-1960 for world complete general and disarmament. A speech which everybody should read. It's about 20 pages. It would make you cry. He refers to Victor Hugo and many other, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's quite a document. And Jack Kennedy picked up on that and repeated it in his speech in Belgrade in 1961, and was also repeated by the non-aligned movement around at the same year. And then in 1962, the Soviet Union put forward its draft treaty on complete and general disarmament, which would take place over 4 years in 5 stages, very concrete steps where every country in the world would reduce its forces down to just enough to maintain local security and would not be allowed to spend any money on any other armaments other than for that. And when you read that treaty, it'll make you cry. It's so rational, so humane, so obvious, so like, why don't we do this? So when you had Jack Kennedy, the United States, leader of the United States, the leader of the Soviet Union, calling for complete and general disarmament, because if we don't, we're going to annihilate ourselves. We're going to destroy the world. They were worried about it. Why aren't we worried about it? but nobody seems to be worried about it. So that was my speech. I tried to resurrect the campaign for complete and general disarmament, and yet what's the response? Absolute silence from everyone. The peace movement here doesn't want to touch it. The world peace movement doesn't want to touch it. You think that'd be important for a peace movement, right? To call for, again, let's revive the campaign for general and complete disarmament. No, not a goddamn word.
Yeah.
Nothing. It's all about, oh, we're against NATO. Because I ended up by saying the only way you can have peaceful resolutions of problems between nations in the world is if there's only one way of achieving a solution, it's by peace, because you can't fight a war because you won't have any weapons to do it. As long as you got weapons of mass destruction, whatever kind you describe them, you can go to war. If they don't exist, you have to solve things peacefully because there's no alternative. But nobody's talking about it. It's all about more war, more war, more war. So I'm very angry and frustrated about that.
I mean, that would take cooperation, and the West is not wanting to cooperate. The West is looking for conflict and confrontation. And
Can I tell you something, or ask you something rather? I think you were part of, Carlo, as well, the duck and cover generation. Did you have that, exercise in school? Yeah.
We had them every 6 months in Canada. We had sirens going off, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were terrified.
I was exposed to this way later when the Iron Curtain came down. Then I learned that, I think it was Sting, I might be wrong, who did "I Hope the Russians Love Their Children Too," the song where he was absolutely terrified. Anyway, I was exposed to this. We were just jollily getting along, and everything is fine on our end, and we didn't know this was hanging above our heads, by the way. But but I think Vladimir should also have a say.
Yeah, I maybe it takes generation. When you mentioned Kennedy, we had relatively recently, we had, Second World War. Then we have Vietnam War. So people kind of remembered and know what war is all about. Now it became like totally distant, reality, reduced to some kind of Hollywood version of that, which is just ridiculous. And then we have maybe, I don't know what is going on, but I remember at a certain moment, there was a defense secretary of the United States, this dude named Ash Carter, who was supposed to be like very intelligent guy, had a degree in physics and science, whatever. But he was writing books. I had to do an interview about him. I was reading about him. He was writing books and studying how we, United States, can win nuclear war. So that was a thinking in the, even though now Russia still have more warheads to destroy the world 10 times over. But somehow there's a strange idea, probably inspired by Hollywood, inspired by all this kind of dream things, that we will come up with some little shelter or like some little rocket which will be hiding in New Zealand or something. So it's become like totally naive, and not people who were not in the war now begin to run all these heavy industries, and so it's very strange, sad.
Yeah, and Herman Kahn wrote on thermonuclear war, and then toured the country, going to Kiwanis and Lions clubs and sodality meetings, trying to convince Americans that 30% of them could survive a nuclear exchange with Russia, with the Soviet Union. I mean, he literally trucked his 350-pound body out of the Hudson Institute to go try to convince Americans that we 3 out of 10 of us will survive. That's a great batting average for baseball, but I don't know how it is for general populations. Not too good. And I want to say one thing about Carl Zhao. He said,
just at least call him his fucking name, Zha.
Okay. He said every country should have nuclear weapons. That was one of the things he said. That was one of his solutions. That's why I keep
he was comparing Libya to the DPRK. Libya gave up his weapons of mass destruction and got destroyed. The DPRK didn't, and it still stands proudly. I think you're mischaracterizing both, but we already had this debate. All I can say is watch that exchange. It's fantastic. What I agree with Scott Ritter on is there's this new generation of Blinkens and idiots who really do think, as Vladimir said, that they can win a nuclear exchange. This thought has been what Carl Jarre maybe falsely alluded to is they have to be rational. They have to think about their fortunes, their future, what happens when they climb out of the boat. And maybe he's wrong on that point. But I think both positions had very great merits and very good historical knowledge. It wasn't one flippant guy and one sort of cover. Just watch it.
I agree. Great debate. I encourage everybody to watch it. I don't agree with Carlos' representation.
But the history was irrelevant. The history that Jarre was bringing up was irrelevant.
Okay.
Well, China did call for a nuclear disarmament a few weeks ago in certain stages, but so they're calling for it. I think Russia would be prepared to do it if the United States, but it's always the United States.
If they could trust the United States, that's the thing.
Yeah. Well, they were going to create an international disarmament organization, which would be staffed by people from all across the world, which would ensure that every nation did exactly each step. So it wouldn't be about untrust; it would just be objectively done. Anyway,
I don't know if you've heard this on I'll add a quick Ritterism, because he was part of this process, as you know. And he said, these warheads have to be destroyed on both sides. And the Russians said, look, we're putting it in, we're melting it down, it's destroyed. And what the other side, the US, said, look, here's the cable that's between the warhead and the armament. And we snipped this cable. and the Russians said, what, you didn't destroy it? No, well, you didn't do it in the wording how we should do it. Look, we snipped the cable. And you can't trust an opponent that's like that. And that was then.
I have bad news for everybody, because every country, I should say every major nuclear armed country intends to win a nuclear exchange. It's they publicly, they'll say, there's mutually assured destruction, but every country, whether it's the USA or Russia, intends to win, to come out on top of a nuclear exchange. Because if it was just about, both sides are destroyed, they wouldn't continually build newer and bigger bombs. They do that because they want to have the advantage.
Yeah.
Because there's no benefit to a weapon you're not willing to use. So they are willing to use it, and they do believe they can win.
It gives Build Back Better a whole new meaning, because there's going to be a lot of building back better to do once the nuclear war is finished. And I think China is in the best position to build back better. And I got to do an argument with that over with somebody famous. But, who could build back better than China? I mean, they were the poorest country in 1949, and look at them now. And I mean, they could just do it all again if they had to. But again, that's incomprehensible. We do not want a nuclear war. And the U.S. would never enter into a treaty unless it benefited themselves, unless they saw it as a means to maintain their hegemony. Because the bottom line is, they don't think in terms of what's best for humanity. Liberals don't do that. Liberals don't care about humanity. They care about maintaining their hegemony and not being, usurped by multipolarism. Vladimir, please interrupt by yelling.
If I can say something about liberals, I think you're I think your insight about liberals serving like class interests, is absolutely correct. This is like definitely part of it. And, I think, maybe traditionally they had a wider view, but now what I hear from kind of, say, intellectual educated liberals, they are fixated on climate, they've fixated on like particular type of food we eat, they fixated on natural resources. So they, I suspect that a lot of people actually think that nuclear war is not such a bad deal. We'll get rid of like 3/4 of our population. We elite will survive, and we'll have, we don't need to worry with less consumption. So it might be part of some people thinking, not everyone, but some people I think probably, I have, my shelter, I invested my billions already there, so I'll be fine. And if we have less people, less consumption, less cars, less pollution, maybe it's
Oh, you're
the
correct.
eugenicists.
There's a movement out of Silicon Valley to just do that. Enstrio, I can't remember what it's called now, but they have 8 or 10 project alignments, and one of them is to depopulate. Not with nuclear weapons primarily, but in other ways. Yeah.
So
not too far
Some,
fetched.
something funny. One fact and one rumor I'd like to add to that. You know, Klaus Schwab, the dark demon, the head of the WEF, is giving up his executive position. And I read, but it was a tabloid news, I don't know which one, that apparently Tony Blair is best positioned to take over. I hope that's true. I really, because he'd be perfect. I think that's just funny.
Yeah, then we have the British. Speaking of Tony Blair, we have the British elections, which won't change too much. They won't change their foreign policy whatsoever. And the American, and as Putin said, we don't care who runs Britain or the United States. It doesn't make any difference to us because their policies won't change. But Britain's in a terrible state.
The 4th of July election, isn't that symbolic?
Yeah, it's strange that they chose that
it's
date.
funny.
For,
If you allow me to say something about, you mentioned, Chris mentioned Putin, you know, it's a question that I would infer that every nation hopes to win nuclear war. Actually, I remember Putin was giving a speech and he actually didn't hope to win.
That's right.
Yeah,
there used to be such a thing as deterrence. Yeah,
he had this very funny comment. He said, well, you know, we'll die, but at least we'll go to heaven because we're fighting for that. So there was no, at least, you know, there was like, you know, maybe this kind of yellow humor, but it was this naivete that we can pull the stunt because, you know, we have 3 scientists at Los Alamos and three guys from MIT who will invent some kind of, you know, magical shield for all of us.
Yeah, I think Putin also said that, well, if they push us to nuclear war, a war without Russia is not worth it living in anyway.
Good point.
So if they attack us, we'll destroy them, and we'll destroy the world, and that's it.
And they don't take him seriously. They should begin. They really should begin.
Yeah, they should.
And that was kind of Carl Jau's point when, you know, Scott was suggesting that China needs to be less aggressive because the West is crazy. I mean, and that's, again, I think we have had a disagreement of that debate, but, you know, the idea that China or Russia need to just, you know, surrender because otherwise we're all going to die. Like, that's just not serious, guys.
Well, that's the point you get with a lot of Serbs. You go to Serbia, and there's even the Serb diaspora. They're divided. Some will say Milosevic was guilty because he didn't give in to the Americans, so they bombed us. It's his fault. If he had surrendered, there would be no war. Well, that's true, probably. But if that's what you want, you got no sense of honor, no sense of sovereignty, no sense of yourself.
That's the argument I hear about Russia as well. Yeah. Why Russia needs this sovereignty? So yes, let's push NATO here. Let's push NATO further. Let's split you apart. You know, just we're peaceful, loving.
Yeah, let them walk all over us. We'll get along. Don't matter. The jackboots walk in. We'll deal with them somehow. Yeah.
I'll just give you not an anecdote, a Reuters article which came out today. Then you would be Camp Bondsteel and the dispopulated Pristina. And this is today. Kosovo lawmakers, Kosovo in quotation marks, back a deal to rent jail space to Denmark, 300 cells to, well, basically deportees. That's how Denmark treats their little U.S. colony, the largest base after, I think, the Ramstein base on European soil, Camp Bondsteel. Yeah, that's what Serbia would be, you know?
Yeah. Well, I remember when the reason that Milosevic, the Yugoslav government finally surrendered to NATO in June 1999 was not because they had lost the war militarily, because they had not. But Chernomyrdin and Ahtisaari came as emissaries for the Americans to visit him and several officials and told them that unless they surrendered, the Americans were going to carpet bomb Belgrade with B-52s and intended to kill 500,000 people in 2 weeks. And they said, you either do that, you either surrender, or that's what we're going to do. That's what the Americans are telling you. So he took that to Parliament and they said, do we continue the war or do we surrender? They said, well, we can't have that happen, so they surrendered. That's when NATO walked in
and saved
lives. Because they used a threat of mass terrorism, of mass destruction. These are the people you're dealing with. They're totally ruthless. Yeah. So they're quite willing to drop nuclear bombs, as we saw in Japan. It doesn't matter what type of weapon they use. They're willing to do these things.
If you allow me to say something, you know, more or less along these lines with, you know, what we discuss, Russia and China and the United States, is that, maybe American ruthlessness, including its kind of pushing the NATO to the Russia and, playing Ukrainian card, is the result of one particular calculation. So I'm just thinking out loud. Calculation is simple. Sooner or later, our main rival will be China. To be ready for the confrontation with China, we have to lay our hands on the Russian resources.
Right.
We need.
I think that was
that's
the plan.
what we need. We need to somehow break Russia apart, accuse it of all possible things, create all these kind of Trojan horses. But we need to do that before actually China gets there. So that explains ruthlessness. Explains even this rhetoric. We can't afford to lose. We can't afford to lose.
Good question.
So they say we can't afford. They come up with this stupid story that Russia wants to grab, half of Eastern Europe. It's not. Russia is a different, kettle of fish now. I don't think they have any interest in expanding. They have tons of territory in Far East to sort of to populate and so on. So, but the main reality is that we need to get to Russian resources before Chinese do, because that's what sort of 21st century confrontation will be all about.
Yeah,
I think you're right on the money. In 2022, that was the plan. Sorry,
yeah,
Chris.
I agree with Vladimir as well. That's completely right. And that's
There
why
was
this war is going to go on. This is like the Orwellian war against Eurasia. That's what it is.
I know you've both been generous with your time, but there was this, I think, interesting question, and I don't honestly know how to answer it. What do you guys think?
I don't know how to answer that question either. How do you deal with insane people when you're sane? How do you deal with these people, except as Russia and China are doing, standing up to them and revealing their insanity? I don't know what else to do.
Well, giving them no options, making sure their best option is to surrender. I mean, and to embrace multipolarism. That's their best option. It's going to be the best for the ruling Western elites to embrace multipolarism, because resisting it and aggressively attacking it is just going to increase the efficiency of their demise. My blood sugar is super low. Vladimir, last points. Chris, any other topics? I don't want to rush people off.
Yeah, I have one last point, and then I have to go. So what everybody observes, at least from my friends in Russia, is that Russia is now very, very seriously that, vis-a-vis West, we cannot trust it. We need to put our economy on a very serious military basis. And that's what kind of the explanation of this new Minister of Defense.
Yes.
He is a top-notch economist, very trusting figure. And they, basically, we fooled around enough through the 90s and zero things. We destroyed, our military capability. Of course, if you think about it, there are other ways of putting money in people's energy to good use rather than building tanks and weapons. But if the West wants to play hardball, I think eventually Russians say, like, yeah, you lost us for one generation. As Lavrov said, we're gonna be ready. We don't want this conversation like you mentioned. We destroy Moscow or you surrender. The Russians are not ready for that.
No. Well, yeah, I think they're going back to reestablishing some of the old Soviet methodologies to control the economy and in this emergency situation. I think a member of the Duma said they intend to revive Smersh.
By all intents and purpose, and except for name, it is revived, which is the spy hunting agency. That's
they wanted to reestablish it formally because as they obviously have internal threats which they still have to deal with. They've placed agents in there over a long period of time. They have to find out where they are and
just remember, not alleging spying, maybe just corruption, but 4 high-ranking military officials in the last 2 days got arrested. So they're properly clearing house now, and they can. Yeah. And most Russians I interacted with on this, they said, yes, more, please, fucking deck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those people are a liability. They're corrupt. You don't know what they're going to do. They get rid of them.
I remember I read, there was this minister before that, long time ago, and I think was it like at the very beginning of Putin, Minister of Defense Serdyukov, this very, very shady character who was, he was known to have so-called Shevnikov women. He would put those women like in top positions, and they were taking bribes and doing all this corruption. And at a certain moment, what they began to do is totally scary. Russia, of course, being a large country, they had, a certain number of military airports, which were located like in the taiga in Siberia, because if you need sort of in one day to send all Russian planes to sort of Japanese border, they have to have a place where to reload, whatever. What the Serdyukov began to do, there was a military airport, there was no construction around it, nothing there. So Serdyukov began to sell the properties around these airports. Total corruption. So all of a sudden, they want to send the planes, and these big shots who bought this property say, no, you're not flying over our heads. So that's all of a sudden, Russian military realized if we need to have our, airplanes on the other side, we cannot do that. So that was probably like one of the wake-up calls. And I think this Belarus is, probably the step number 79 in this process. But they are getting ready. They were probably not even quite ready when they started the Ukraine campaign. There was certain, but
they were far from ready. But yeah, great concluding thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, Vladimir.
By the way, that's the good old days that the US wants back. Like absolutely mired in corruption and poverty.
We want Vladimir and Chris to join us again in the future, so I will thank them for their time. But we better end now. So we'll be back on Tuesday. I want to thank all the viewers, all the comments, especially to Vladimir and Chris. We'll see you guys again. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you for having us, and nice chatting with you all.
Nice chatting with you all too,
Thanks.
Vladimir.
Thank you. That was a great exchange.